Welcome to YIMBY Nation, a podcast exploring U.S. housing and the roadblocks to building more equitable neighborhoods. Join Jimmy, Peter, and V as they, and special guests, offer their unique perspectives on building more diverse communities and addressing the social problems that emanate from the lack of decent, safe, and affordable housing. Our hosts have served in the fields of advocacy and nonprofit, public, and private development, and are driven by their passion for community empowerment. Join the conversation and share your thoughts on social using hashtag YIMBYNation.
Welcome to YIMBY Nation Season 2, Episode 2. Our guest today is Burhan Azeem, a Cambridge City Councillor. Cambridge recently passed the most comprehensive upzoning reform in the nation, allowing for 6-story housing development citywide. In this episode, we will explore how historic this change came about, what it means for other cities, and how it connects to the broader goal of YIMBY movement. Jimmy, Peter, and I are very thrilled to have you join us, Burhan. Welcome.
Thank you guys for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Wonderful. So, Burhan, congratulations again on the landmark upzoning in Cambridge. For our listeners that are not familiar with your work, can you tell us a bit about yourself, and can you walk us through how this great reform came to life?
Yeah, absolutely. Oftentimes in the policymaking space, politicians are kind of one of two strides. They might care about an issue deeply, but they're typically not policy area experts. And then you have, advocates and those sorts of people who can be really supportive of policy change, but are not fundamentally in the room where it happens, where you finally have your votes being made. I am, finishing up my second term on City Council, but I also, before this, created an organization called Abundant Housing Massachusetts, which was one of the early YIMBY orgs, and really is the main pro-housing organization within Massachusetts. We work with the governor on the implementation of all the housing acts that have happened more recently, and the passing of our ADU legalization bill, for example. So I kind of came to City Hall with this interesting mix of deep housing expertise and being able to be lucky in the room where it happened. And so over the last 4 years, every year I've passed one big housing reform, from eliminating parking mandates to expanding our low-income affordable housing zoning, to finally this one where, there's been a lot of zoning reforms across the country and they've been great. But if you legalize, kind of like when Minneapolis did, legalize triple deckers everywhere, that's fantastic. But in Cambridge, which is mostly triple deckers, it's not really going to do very much at all. And so I was kind of interested in how can we re-legalize cities for the first time, right? That's something that a lot of zoning reforms had not been able to do at that point. And so we went through this process, and I really looked at Paris as an example of it's just 6 stories everywhere. It's beautiful. Most people like it, and it helped visualize a city that people could love. And so we went and we did that in our reform. And it's also resulting in the creation of new housing. I think that we're going to produce a significant chunk of the entire state's housing in the next coming years. And that's something I'm particularly excited about as well.
Wow, very impressive. Very impressive. Was it very difficult making this transition from what you were typically used to?
Yeah, I mean, before this reform happened, about 85% of Cambridge land was non-conforming, meaning what was there was already too dense for zoning, right? So we had basically half the city was then zoned for single-family homes in the 1960s and 70s, and single-family homes themselves are fine. But what would happen is that a triple-decker or an older apartment building would fall into disrepair. They would need to rebuild it, and then they could only rebuild it as a single-family home. And so you would actually lose units over time. And that's why, in both Cambridge, but also Somerville, Boston, the nearby cities, all of us have not reached the peak population we were at 1950. And we're not cities that are, struggling with job or economic growth or anything like that. But we just haven't been able to reach the population we had 75 years ago. And so what that all comes to say is that we went from a place where most buildings were non-conforming to making sure that all of them were legalized, and then we still had space on top to add more housing. And so when you're coming from such a bad place where, Boston has the longest zoning code in America, Cambridge wasn't too far off, like, any big change like that will not just feel big, it'll feel radical. And so it took a year and a half of us just talking to an enormous number of people, this being the main topic area of city council before we were able to get it passed.
Thanks, Burhan. Why was this moment the right time for Cambridge to move towards citywide 6-story zoning?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that forever, before UMB movement came up, it was about individual projects, right? You might get a developer coming forth with a project. And I think that the pros and cons of that are that, like, it's very substantiated, right? Like at the end of it, if you vote yes, you'll probably get that building. And that was nice. And it was limited in that it was only one building or a couple of buildings. And so it's not like it would affect the whole city. And at the same time, like the downsides of that was it didn't affect the whole city. And in some ways, each fight is as big as it is going to be, where the opponents of development will turn out, where the supporters of development will turn out. And so you might as well go for something big. Obviously, we're in the middle of a national conversation where for the last 8, 9 years, from California to Oregon to more recently, Texas and other places have all been having this conversation around housing. And I think that it made sense for us to chime in. We've been struggling to pass something for the last 6, 7 years, and it took all different sorts of forms in terms of legalizing multifamily housing everywhere. And I think the stars aligned, the council was great. And this national moment, I mean, we did it before this book Abundance came out, but that really helped to bolster the wings too of like nationally, I think a huge percentage of people across the country were coming to the same point.
And what was the book again that you mentioned?
Abundance by Ezra Klein.
Okay.
What were the biggest challenges that you faced in getting this reform passed, and how did you overcome them?
The biggest was definitely just the height. Like the height is scary, right? Like if you're living in a block that's like mostly 1 or 2 story buildings, and now there's going to be a 6-story building with 60 apartments, like that's kind of scary. And it's not only just like people who are scared of heights, but you can imagine that means that on a block that might have had 60 residents, there's now a 60-unit apartment, and that's twice as many cars on the block, right? And so there are all these downstream effects that make it really challenging, right? I think what you do is that like growth is also a skill and exercise, and there's growing pains, right? Like that's a analogy for a reason. And so you just have to be good at solving those particular problems as well, rather than throw your hands up. But I think that that was the biggest part of it. And then the other side was just technically writing it, right? Like this was almost 100 pages of zoning reform, of which 90 pages was just deletion. And so it was an incredible effort to try to get here.
Did you were there groups that were vehemently opposed to what you were trying to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. We had both some criticism from the left, which we really tried to manage, but then our biggest was from just like a local anti-housing group called the Cambridge Citizens Coalition, which were just neighbors mostly in the most expensive, largest home neighborhoods who were just like vehemently opposed to this level of density.
I think some people, they're very comfortable in their big house and they don't want anyone around them.
Yeah.
That happened. So then on that note, how did community engagement or that resistance that you talked about shape the final policy?
Less so than you would think, in that, I just thought the political timing was really right. And to credit to me and all my other councilors, like we spent an incredible amount of time trying to build community support. This passed at the end of the day, 8-1. And so one colleague was persuaded by the pushback and just voted no. But I think the other colleagues were like, this was not the politically easiest thing for them to do, but they realized that, it really does matter that we are facing through a housing crisis. And for this singular vote, they were willing to kind of compromise and kind of come along, realizing that, this was the moment to kind of do something, and otherwise they would not be proud of the work that they've done in City Hall. So incredible amount of courage from all my colleagues as well. But I think this was mostly a story of political courage in terms of City Hall, and then also just a understanding of the problem and taking it both literally and seriously, that, we're now the most expensive metro in the country. We just beat out New York, and that's kind of a very difficult place to be.
So when did this pass, and how much development has occurred and actually been completed since that time?
So it was February 10th that it passed. That means
this year.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that means it's a little bit too early for things to have been built, but we have maybe like 5 or 6 projects that are in the 60-ish unit range that are going through, and that's a pretty big change. For example, in Riverside, one of the neighborhoods in Cambridge, in the last 15 years, you've seen 3 units built. And now in the single project, you're going to see 60. So that's almost like, 200 years of housing in this one building, right? And it's just been 6 months. And so I think it's going to be a pretty big change in the longer run.
What role did data or research play in convincing your colleagues and the public that this was in the best interest of Cambridge?
Yeah, that was huge. I think that one of the biggest things is that, Massachusetts makes this problem all the time, which is that when you're passing a zoning, you looked at the full zoned capacity and say, like, that's how much housing is going to build, right? Like, if we allow for 5,000 new units, we're going to get 5,000 new units. And we just know that's not the case. Most homeowners don't want to sell their homes. A lot of like buildings, there's just too much existing value that you're not going to go and tear down a 4-unit building to make a 5-unit building, right? So there's all these downstream consequences that people don't think of. And so we were really able to use data to say, like, if we legalize about X number of homes, we know on average we're going to get 0.25% redevelopment per year of that total zoned capacity. And so in, a 10 years time span, we might get like 2.5% of our zoned capacity. And that was really helpful because then we were able to say that is the number we want to optimize. How many units do we think we can handle in the next 10 years? Do we want in the next 10 years? And that's not based on the whole zoned capacity, but just 2.5% of it.
You keep mentioning these downstream effects, and that's something I had wanted to discuss today. Also, there are sometimes unintended negative consequences of public policies. What are some of those possible negative consequences from density? And how are you thinking about addressing these possible negative consequences?
Yeah, that's very helpful framing. I would say that there's two types of problems to take a step back. First, right, there's tractable and non-tractable problems, right? So if your city is just so expensive that people can't live there, if you just don't have enough homes to have enough space for the kids who are born in your city to fundamentally stay there, that is a non-solvable problem in the sense that, like, if you're not going to build more homes, like, fundamentally, it's like a drought, right? If there's just not enough water to go around, not everyone will get water. And you just cannot fix that without having more water. There's no easy solutions, and there's no hard solutions. Now, if you instead say that you are allowing for housing growth, like there are a lot of like things that you have to deal with, right? We have to deal with more sewage and water usage. You have to deal with more traffic. You have to deal with how do you integrate all your new residents into your community? How do you deal with more children potentially in the school system? And these are all things you have to deal with, right? Like, I think this is why if you have a place where you only legalize zoning, but then otherwise are not comfortable with growth, you're going to struggle with pain. And to some extent, I think that, this is what you see in other places. Like in Canada, they had a huge surge of immigration, which I generally support, but like they didn't do all the other things that allow you to integrate it. So they just ended up having a really severe housing shortage. Like growth is something you need to manage. And those problems sometimes can be easy, sometimes can be hard, but they are solvable. And so part of all of that is like we're looking into building a citywide shuttle system such that we can try to help people move throughout the city. And, for our schools, we've actually been seeing a shrinking enrollment. So we actually have a lot of capacity, but then are also thinking about what is the time under which we would want to renovate our schools to make sure that we can meet those goals and that number of people. You go down the list and there's this whole number of conversations that we're having to kind of tackle and solve these problems. And what's also nice about density is that, your property taxes do go up, right? If you replace a single family home with like 6 or 8 units, you do get more taxes from that. And that makes it such that you have more resources to solve these problems. And on a per unit basis, if a garbage truck can go in front of a house and it can collect 8 cans of trash and 8 people are paying property taxes versus just the one, it's actually a lot more efficient. And so you do get some economies of scale here where you can use that money to better use. And so everyone else gets better service, right? We don't have like automatic battery recycling in Cambridge, which I don't think many places have at all. But, you can't put batteries in the trash. But hey, if we have a larger budget, if we have more efficiencies, maybe we can send a truck along that will just, pick up batteries from everyone. Or we collect trash right now once a week. In other bigger cities, you collect it more frequently, right? Maybe, you get tired. You're like, I don't want to wait till the end of the week, or I don't want to have to worry about like today's the day and I have to remember. And if it's a holiday, do I shift it over by one day for like garbage collection? Well, maybe we'll be able to do it 3-4 times a week such that you don't have to stress about it. Like there's also benefits that come to the other residents as well. And then there's real problems, but I think they're solvable, and they're better than the problems of not growing.
This is, I guess, more not such a mathematical or quantitative portion, but what about the impact of density on the quality of life?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I would say is that there's definitely a change, right? I think that you are building a more urban community, and that is true anytime, anywhere you build housing. And so that is a change in your lifestyle, right? You'll probably have more traffic on your streets, but in other ways, right, you'll probably have to deal with more neighbors, more noise, all these other sorts of things. And I think that to some extent, like that is a legitimate downside, but also I would say that, I personally love cities. I love sitting in the park and watching like all my neighbors kind of do their thing, and you just get a sense of like there's a real community here. There's people in their lives that are really enjoying themselves. It's nice to have friends who live like only a few blocks down, so you can, on your way to work, like knock on their door if you have some time and just say like, "Hey, how's it going?" Right? There's all sorts of real benefits that come from like living in a city too, and then there's downsides. It's living in a city is not for everyone, but I think it's much more of a lifestyle choice rather than it's just like a downside of having more neighbors and density.
So, what you're saying is that if you want to live in the country, you should move out to the country.
And it's not conversion.
I would say, this imagination that you bought a house and so you are owed that the whole municipality or the whole district that you're in will never change. I think is just not true, right? Like you own your property, you made your decision, but that doesn't mean you get to control everyone else's lives and what they do with it.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned something earlier, discussing economies of scale, which we know that very often it has some good benefits to it. But at the same time, there are those, as we just talked about, with the entitlements that I moved into this big house and I want to stay in this big house and I want that privacy and the government should accept it. And then you also have those that might be concerned about, let's say, public housing, right? Especially who they want to see in their neighborhood. So, and I think you're right, it's a very difficult thing to solve. So that makes me wonder, what impact do you anticipate this will have on housing affordability and also whether it's the short term or long term in terms of this discussion, right? So what do you think?
Well, I think that we just ranked, I think this week there's an article coming out of how we just beat New York City for most expensive housing costs. So there's not many ways that we can go down, Like we already have the most expensive housing in the nation. Um, so I think that, we got to try something, and this is us trying. I think, I particularly do believe in a supply demand argument. If you build more housing and prices will stabilize or they will go down. But even if you don't, we do have an affordability requirement within this. So in that 60 unit building, 12 will be built for low income residents. And that is 12 units that will be forever affordable, right? And in this particular case of that Riverside apartment, I told you it's replacing a funeral home. So you went from 0 apartments, of which 0 were affordable, to now 60 apartments, of which 48 are market rate, and you can believe in supply and demand like I do. Or if you don't, then there's still those 12 low income units that just did not exist before. And so what I think is that policy can in many ways be win-win. And I think that as long as you're comfortable with more density, whether you want only like low income housing or you mostly want the market rate housing, this can be a win-win in that it replaces a worse status quo.
Is that 20%? I think in this case, you said 12 out of 60. Is that 20% all across the border for this new implementation?
Yes, for any 6-story building, you have to have the 20%. If you're building just to 4 stories, you can do it all market rate if you wanted to.
As you know, with a lot of policy, the devil's in the details. And in this case, you have an inclusionary zoning requirement that 20% of the units be affordable. And you mentioned that they are permanently affordable. So I presume the affordable units are deed restricted. And if so, what income level has to be met for these to be deemed to be affordable? And a second question, you talked about needing to plan for growth and needing to obviously plan for policies to be successful in implementation. has there been any kind of property tax abatement or pilot payments in lieu of taxes being made available for the affordable units so that they can be more operationally successful over time?
Yeah, I think that those are great questions, right? And I think that it's important to talk about them because my fundamental goal, and also as I talk about being, a policy expert in the realm of housing, of like you really need to take all the details seriously and literally. Otherwise, you can pass a great zoning, but like it fundamentally just won't build any housing. So I want to answer in a little bit of detail here. So the first and fundamental thing is like, you can build to 4 stories without inclusionary, and that both serves as a ground, right? If you start seeing a bunch of 4-story buildings instead of the 6-story buildings, it means that our inclusionary is really tipping the economics to favor those more. Um, and right now we're seeing one 4-story building that's 4 units, but besides that, everyone else is proposing 6-story buildings, which is about what we expect, right? Because we did like try to make it 6, like why 6 in particular? It's Paris is a great example, but it's also because the building code changes about at 6 stories. You get a lot of economies of scale at building a 60 or 80 unit building. And so we really did that. I think that it hit a sweet spot in a bunch of different ways. Um, Okay, but an inclusionary requirement, just like any cost that you add to development, can still have an impact on the economics of development. There's also high interest rates, there's tariffs, all these other things. Like, wouldn't you just get more housing if you had a lower inclusionary rate or all these other things, right? Well, I would say that inclusionary definitely has an impact. We're talking about $100 a square foot is about what our roughest estimates are. Our AMI average is about 80%, which is not that low given that we're such an expensive metro. It's about $2,300 a month for an affordable unit, but still, like you lose a couple $100,000 building it, which means that it's just that much less money you have to play with to try to make your building pencil in a moment that's really hard for them to pencil. So we're looking at a bunch of different things. We weren't able to pass these in the initial bill because that was really focused on dimensional changes, but we're trying to pass something by the end of the year. And we have 3 options before us that we're looking at. One is to just lower the inclusionary rate. I think that this is the least popular of the 3, but you could just lower it from 20 to 10%. It has that much less impact and so on and so forth, right? The second thing we're looking for is to just do basically a tax increment financing, which is like we'll just give you money up front, valued at what the cost of inclusionary is having for you. And then in exchange, we get full property taxes from you over time, right? And so we will recoup that money over time. What's good and bad is that, we pride ourselves in Cambridge on being really well run. So we provide a lot of services, but we also have the lowest property taxes in the state, meaning that it will take a long time for us to get that money back. You know what I mean? And so I think that ends up being a little bit less interesting. And also giving up money up front is great for the developer, right? Because they're getting a 0 interest loan basically that they just don't have to pay back except through property taxes. But for that same reason, it's really hard for the city to do that at scale, right? We could do it for 1 building, we could do it for 2. If we really want tens of thousands of units, we're talking about billions of dollars. Like, I don't think that's something that the city can sustain. And so that kind of gets us to the third idea, which is tax abatements, right? And that's exactly what we're looking at, right? Can you do a tax abatement? Now, tax abatement is valued at about 7% of inclusionary by my rough estimates. So that would bring your effective inclusionary down from 20% to 13%, which might still be a little bit too high. And so then the goal is, can you make it such that both the abatement and the inclusionary scale in proportion such that you really don't get development impact? That's kind of what Baltimore does, which they say like, you can give us money as a developer, however you want the city to a tax abatement through other sorts of ways, but we are only on the hook for that level of subsidy to our inclusionary units. And I think it's a really clean model where you still get the 20% in Baltimore, but only if the city's willing to like shove up the cash, and they can do it through a bunch of different ways. So we can mix and match between these 3 things to kind of make the development pencil. And so that's a conversation that we're having right now. I think that they'll be hopefully successful. It's always tough to have these conversations. It's nice if you can just get everything you want for free. But we all have to also reckon with that it's a difficult economic time and we're trying to do the best we can. But these are definitely the live topic right now. And hopefully by the end of the year, you'll hear what decision we make one way or the other.
So Did I understand that the inclusionary units have to serve households below 80% of area median income?
It's the average is 80%, so some will be 60%, some will be 100%.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Final question of the day. What's next for housing policy in Cambridge? I mean, I guess where do you go from here?
Yeah, so there's, I would say we took decades of anti-housing policy to get us to this point. And so, as ambitious as this bill was, it was like 90 pages of deletion, which is extraordinary for housing legislation. There's still a lot of work left to be done. So we've now passed the fundamental zonings. As Peters was saying, we still have to make the economics work, right? Especially in this moment. So inclusionary reform, fixing that is our goal. Also, this 6 stories was for our neighborhoods. So in our corridors, in our squares, we're still thinking about going higher density. So we still have 2 more zoning petitions left to go, which is about higher densities in our higher squares and corridors. And then we have this problem that New York and a couple of other problems have, which is that, once you legalize housing, once you make it economical even, then you start getting building and, opponents of development will look at anything that they can find to try to oppose it. So we're currently going through a process where they're kind of abusing the landmarking, the historical process, the demolition delay process that we have to kind of stop these developments. And I think that's unfortunate. Like Cambridge is older than the country, so we do have a lot of historic buildings and like some stuff that I really love. And at the same time, like housing is such a top priority at this moment that we can't let them just abuse that generous process to be able to stop any development in the city. So I think in terms of recalibrating it so that they can't use it to stop housing is probably going to be the third big thing. And then if I got a stretch goal, the stretch goal is permitting reform in that like it takes way too long to get your permits. I would love for you to be able to go from start to finish in 30 days. That would be really, really ideal. But there's already like I think 4 different pieces of legislation, so it's a lot of work ahead of us.
I'm glad you brought up the historic aspect because I was going to ask you how much of I guess the areas that is part of this beginning process is affected by the historic commission or the historic preservation. So with that being said, how do you balance the growth with historic preservation, even in concerns as you're trying to expand on more housing in Cambridge?
I think a good litmus test for historic preservation is does anyone besides the people on the historic commission or abutting neighbors know the history of the building? Like there should be some bar of like it is notable to people, not just to people who are really trying to find history and everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the second bar is that is it notable or historic before redevelopment is planned? Like if the building already has history, it should stand on its own merits. Like the building was found historical. We wanted to go through this process before our development was proposed because, we've always thought that this is like a landmark of a building. And then there's like rules and limits that you can have, limits on the total number of buildings that can be historic in the city and so on and so forth. But fundamentally requires good faith decision making, and that is really hard. I would say that, right now there's a development in Cambridge that is a Sears catalog house that was built that is just old now, and they want to replace it with 2 single family homes with 4 units. It's not even that high density, but now they're saying that this like Sears catalog home is historic. And like that's where I start drawing a problem. Like fundamentally it is like a mass produced building. It cannot be historic in that way. And so I think that you hear a lot of things that are very, very evidently like not historic as well. And then the middle is the gray area, and that's always where the difficulty lies in policy making. So we're kind of all in the middle of figuring that out. But I think it's a fun conversation. What's nice is that when, your zoning, which is the biggest in the country, passes 8-1, it does show there's a lot of demand for housing and a lot of political consensus, which makes those conversations that much easier. And so I think that we'll muddle through them, but we will get through them.
I know that here in Connecticut, I am on the State Historic Preservation Council, and we are very open to listening to developers and listening to ventures of what you have. So hopefully your Historic Preservation Council is the same, but it sounds like it's not. But I think growth and change is good. And this particular one, it is definitely for the best.
Thank you.
So as we wrap up the conversation, what do you hope listeners take from this discussion today, and what action items would you encourage them to consider for their own respective communities?
I think that's an exciting time in the UMB like pro housing movement in terms of like leveling up your ambitions. I think that, at least what I've seen in my own area is like for a long time we were just fighting down zonings or fighting for individual developments. And that was kind of depressing when you were playing a little bit of defense, or if you won one building. And then we started doing this level of like, which I think has been the last era of like legalizing duplexes or a little bit more density here or there, which is also nice, but it doesn't fundamentally make that big of a difference. And I'm hoping now that we're kind of getting to a point where there's enough political consensus to, in cities, really re-legalize cities. Like I want to see the next Paris, the next Manhattan kind of pop up in the US. Like that would be a really wonderful idea as someone who really loves urban form, but also even in suburbia and other places, like legalizing not just a duplex, but 3 or 4 units where you're really adding quite a bit of density, even though it's gentle density. I think that those sorts of reforms that if they're broad-based can have a huge and dramatic impact while also trying to respect what's kind of already there. And I'm kind of hoping that we're kind of entering this new phase where we're able to get these bigger reforms and really go from, a decade of passing policy, but not seeing the numbers on housing construction bump up that dramatically to getting to a place where we're really building the amount of housing that rents go down across the country, and the country hopefully looks a little bit different in the next decade than it did in the last.
I like it. Where can people learn more about this effort that you are doing?
You can always visit our city website or follow me on Twitter. I'm always posting about each twist and turn that kind of happens along. But our city website has a lot of great resources.
Can you tell us the website again?
CambridgeMA.gov. And also, we're lucky enough to get a lot of press from The Economist to like Fortune and Forbes and all this sorts of stuff. And so if you Google around, you'll see a lot of what has happened already and why it was a cool story, not just for me.
Impressive. Peter, any last word?
I could go on with this conversation for a long time, so I won't extend this that much. I think what you've done is groundbreaking, and I hope that it gets more widely recognized and emulated by other small cities such as Cambridge and sort of first ring suburbs from larger cities that have this kind of pent up demand but have not provided for any means of addressing it. And I think you're, very open to what are the ancillary challenges that this poses and how do you address those. We didn't talk about parking. You did mention that one of your former reforms was to do away with parking requirements. I'm curious as to how that is playing out. And, I think a lot of this is going to be addressed over time as these issues start to really come to the forefront when you have, real development occurring in large numbers. As you said, you're only at the beginning right now.
Awesome. Well, we certainly enjoyed this conversation, and thank you so much for sharing this with our listeners, and we wish you all the luck.
And congratulations.
Thank you so much, guys. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
And this concludes episode 6, season 2. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us and listening to today's episode of YIMBY Nation. Continue the conversation in your communities and on social using hashtag YIMBY Nation. Connect with V at www.vaseconstruction.com. Connect with Jimmy at www.sincereconsulting.com. And connect with Peter by searching Collaborative Development Consulting on LinkedIn.com. Please leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform so we can continue helping communities thrive. Email us at contact@yimbynation.com or visit the podcast website at www.yimbynation.com. Until next time.